Those who have been to a Membership 101 meeting with me may recall me mentioning what, on the surface, may seem self-evident. This is a church. We do have a sanctuary, a choir, and pews. I pray and give sermons. But this hasn't always been that obvious to everyone. In 2004, the Texas Comptroller decided that Unitarian Universalism was not a religion because it does not have one system of belief, and she stripped the Red River UU Church in Denison of its tax-exempt status. It only took a matter of weeks for her to reverse that decision, I assume after some lessons on the concept of a covenantal religion. But it's not for tax purposes that I bring up at Membership 101 that we are, in fact, a church. I talk about how many people find us because they're excited about our social justice work. But I point out that we're not a union hall or social services agency. Others enjoy our interesting programs and engaging workshops, but we're not really a community center or a school. Lots of folks come to hear great music, but despite the great acoustics of our sanctuary, this isn't a concert hall. There is a spiritual aspect to what we do here. We ask each new member to not only be involved in the life of the church, but to be intentional about their spiritual life as well. That is what informs and undergirds our social justice work, our programming, and our creating covenant with one another. And because the Comptroller was correct in that we don't have one singular system of belief, we don't specify what anyone's spiritual life will look like. It may be prayer, yoga, or memorizing poetry. However, one thing I often suggest as an example of a spiritual practice is walking meditation. This is often done outdoors in a park, or if you're lucky enough to live near them, in the woods or in the forest. Now, many of you have picked up on the thread running through the sermon topics this year. There have been a lot of reflection on the concepts of vision, mission, and covenant, leading up to the congregational vote next week. The theme of roots and branches was chosen to underscore those reflections, as it refers to the roots of our community that ground us and the branches that extend out like our aspirations. Today, we end the month's theme of knots and burls, but I pretty much exhausted that metaphor during my last sermon. I thought that this week I'd talk about actual woods, forests, and other places in nature where we go to find solitude, feel closer to that which is larger than ourselves, then return refreshed, and perhaps even transformed into community. But it would be difficult to not also mention what is symbolized in many faith traditions by journeys through the woods, forests, and by climbing mountains. Journeying has long been a metaphor for living. People refer to their spiritual journey, and newly married couples are said to be beginning a journey together. Sometimes people will ask others to walk with them as they experience something, perhaps a life-changing illness. In literature and religious texts, beginning a journey often included a trip through the woods or forest, which is revealed as a place of transformation. Moses wandered around the desert for 40 years, leading the Israelites to pray for the invention of GPS. And Jesus was led into the wilderness and fasted for 40 days and 40 nights. Small wonder so many faith traditions encourage adherents to take a pilgrimage as a way to search for new or expanded meaning in their lives. Hindus are encouraged to take a pilgrimage to a place associated with legendary events from the lives of various gods, often a sacred city, lake, or mountain. Buddhists may travel to the birthplace of the Buddha in India, or the site of his first sermon in Nepal. Now, of course, perhaps the best known is the Hajj, the Islamic pilgrimage to Mecca, which is one of the 5 pillars of Islam. And some will journey to Medina, the second holiest site in Islam, the final resting place of Muhammad. During his life, when the Prophet Muhammad wanted to get away, he would seclude himself in a mountain cave for several nights of prayer. Later, at age 40, he reported being visited by Gabriel in the cave, where he stated he received his first revelation from God. After Jesus fed the 5,000, a feat rivaled only by the Houston Rodeo Barbecue Contest yesterday, he needed some alone time. He sent the disciples on ahead while he went up the mountain to be by himself. Mountains loom large, physically and figuratively, in our world and in our lives. Characters in the Hebrew Bible often associated being high atop a mountain as being on holy ground, and to being nearer Jehovah. Little wonder, few landscapes can rival the awe-inspiring strength and beauty of the mountains. It's easy to imagine why people feel introspective, closer to nature, perhaps even closer to the divine in the mountains. There's even a Unitarian Universalist retreat center in North Carolina named the mountain. In the last speech he ever delivered, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. told listeners he had been to the mountaintop. In that speech, Dr. King told of standing atop a vantage point where he had seen the promised land, although he questioned if he would live to complete the journey there. In the speech, he reflected on the past and invoked the powerful metaphor of mountaintop to instill hope in those who came to hear him. He considered the mountaintop as a venue to witness the greatness of human capacity, as well as a place where one could glimpse the promised land. Near the end of the speech, he tells the gathered crowd, "Like anyone, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place, but I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will, and He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over, and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land." Since time began, people have returned to mountains for meditation, comfort, and inspiration. Standing atop the mountain, we feel its strength supporting us, and we look out into a never-ending star-filled universe. Standing atop the mountain, we feel its strength supporting us, and we look out beyond the horizon to what Dr. King referred to as beloved community. I remember the view from a mountain of sorts, a cliff atop an enormous bluff within driving distance of where I went to college. We would drive into the woods, park, and walk to Lakiji Rock, an outcropping from which we could look down and see nothing but hills and trees for literally miles. In the distance, you could just make out a sliver of Cave Run Lake. At night, we would lie on our backs on the rock and look up at multitudes of stars, unobstructed by any human-created illumination. This was in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains in the Daniel Boone National Forest. Now, in folklore, characters inevitably find themselves in the forest, and in Grimm's fairy tales, the hero always ventures into the forest, which is revealed as a place of transformation. After finding herself over the rainbow, Dorothy discovered that the yellow brick road led through a forest of decidedly anthropomorphic trees and animals. Tolkien wrote of the Old Forest, Mirkwood, and Fangorn Forest, and Harry Potter knows of the Forbidden Forest near Hogwarts. In Stephen Sondheim's musical Into the Woods, familiar and new characters enter alone into the forest. Throughout the show, they realize the advantages of depending on one another, even as those moments in the woods alone and with others, transform their lives. They come to realize what Trappist monk, writer, and mystic Thomas Merton told us. We need to learn to be content while alone, perhaps in those moments in the woods, in order to feel and appreciate the real depth of true companionship. In his book, No Man is an Island, he wrote, and please excuse the exclusivist language, it was the early 50s. The man who fears to be alone will never be anything but lonely, no matter how much he may surround himself with people. But the man who learns in solitude and recollection to be at peace with his own loneliness and to prefer its reality to the illusion of merely natural companionship comes to know the invisible companionship of God. Such a one is alone with God in all places, and he alone truly enjoys the companionship of other men. UU minister, author, and chaplain Kate Braestrup tells stories about the forest being a literal as well as a metaphorical liminal place of threatening danger or one of refuge, a chance at possible adventure or transformation. Back in 2007, I read a review in Entertainment Weekly of Braestrup's memoir, Here If You Need Me. Braestrup, a chaplain to game wardens in the forests of Maine, tells of witnessing life-altering events that sometimes end sadly, sometimes end happily, but are always, to some degree, transformative. Her stories often tell of people who are lost in the woods, either by intention or happenstance. The game wardens she talks to usually comment on the foolishness of those wandering away alone, or skating on a pond whose ice is not quite yet frozen over. But several times in the book, as she stands in the awe-inducing moonlit forest, or gazes at the shimmering ice crystals on the surface of a lake, Braestrup expresses an understanding of why someone would make that seemingly foolish choice to come alone to witness the sacred place of potential spiritual renewal. It occurred to me, the game wardens only hear about the unfortunate choices that end in tragedy. It's never reported to them when those who come to the wilderness are spiritually transformed and renewed and return home safely. In this morning's reading, Braestrup's friend Hannah told her that the time she spent walking through the blizzard on the lake, miles from nowhere, was the most joyous time of her whole life. Yet she was pleased when it ended. There it is, Braestrup said, another spiritual paradox. The joy of experiencing that alone time, but looking forward to being welcomed back into community, knowing each is an opportunity for transformation. This really resonates with me. While I believe most would consider me an extrovert, it actually takes a lot of energy for me to put myself out there, and I need to re-energize in private. So I consider myself an ambivert, on a pendulum between an introvert and an extrovert. While I enjoy my time around people, I also enjoy my alone time. Now, as an extroverted introvert, Jesus would speak to large crowds, but then he would seek out secluded times of prayer and meditation. Henry David Thoreau famously spent time alone at Walden Pond, observing and journaling his observations of nature. But he apparently walked into town to catch up on the news and, as rumor has it, have his mother do his laundry. Transcendentalists had as a core belief the inherent goodness of people and of nature, and longed for a more intense spiritual experience than the calm rationalism of Unitarianism. This philosophical movement took place during the early 1800s, and Thoreau was one of them. Someone who lived more recently, whose efforts seemed to resonate with the Transcendentalists, was the Trappist monk Thomas Merton, whom I mentioned earlier. He lived at the Abbey of Our Lady of Gethsemane near Bardstown, Kentucky. He asked for a hermitage, a secluded retreat to be built on the outskirts of the hilly and wooded grounds. He wanted a place to be by himself, a place of solitude. But oddly enough, Merton's transformational experience did not happen alone in the hermitage. It happened on a street corner in the largest city in the state. In Conjectures of a Guilty Bystander, Merton wrote, "In Louisville, at the corner of 4th and Walnut, in the center of the shopping district, I was suddenly overwhelmed with the realization that I loved all these people, that they were mine and I theirs, that we could not be alien to one another, even though we were total strangers. It was like waking from a dream of separateness, of spurious self-isolation in a special world. This sense of liberation from an illusory difference was such a relief and such a joy to me that I almost laughed out loud, as if the sorrows and stupidities of the human condition could overwhelm me, now that I realize what we all are. And if only everybody could realize this. But it cannot be explained. There's no way of telling people that they are all walking around, shining like the sun." Like the Transcendentalists, Merton sought spirituality that balanced a life of contemplation and action in nature and in the world. Other prominent members of the Transcendental Club in Cambridge, besides Thoreau, included Theodore Parker, Margaret Fuller, and Ralph Waldo Emerson. In a quote found in the complete prose works of Ralph Waldo Emerson, he wrote, "It is easy in the world to live after the world's opinion. It's easy in solitude to live after our own. But the great man is he who in the midst of the crowd keeps with perfect sweetness the independence of solitude." We go into the woods. We may be transformed. We return and look to live out our transformation with others, and it is hoped, even share it with them. Or, as Thomas Merton discovered, we may be transformed on a busy street corner and take that newfound gift to contemplate while alone. As the Texas controller learned, I'm not here to tell you how to live your spirituality here in this church. But I hope that each of you will not only be involved in the life of this church, you will be intentional about your spiritual life as well. And perhaps you'll begin by journeying into the woods. That it might be so, I invite the congregation to say, Amen.